Maeve, it's exciting to talk to somebody who's been through not only, electronic supply chains, but led supply chain work. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself, and then let's talk about, this challenge of morphing a serialization company that's seen by regulatory compliance as good in regulatory compliance, but we're now going to be talking supply chain.
So for me, my background, my technical background is supply chain and logistics. I've worked in the high-tech industry for over 20 years and then moved into the development space. What's been interesting for me in working in high-tech and then going to international development is that working for organizations like Dell, they were very much ahead of their game. But yet when I moved into global health, not only working in third world countries, but working with pharmaceutical companies, life sciences, I felt like that I had gone back about 20 years. And I really felt like that there was, a lot of the basics of the supply chain actually that were not in place, but yet they were all trying to build sophisticated systems when a foundation didn't exist. So it's been an interesting journey. Today I work as an independent advisor. And I work for organizations like Gavi, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Asian Development Bank, but I also work with a lot of pharma companies and also a lot of startups, basically looking at how innovation and especially digitization can be adopted and scaled in developing countries. So doing a lot of work in Papua New Guinea, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, so on and so forth. What's interesting about those is that those countries don't have legacy systems. Their regulatory systems are a little bit easier to advocate for the reasons, the advantages of adopting digitization. So you're starting to see that there's a lot more work and effort being done around data, around digital solutions and innovation in these countries that I think actually will be beneficial to developing countries. And it's also getting these pharma companies actually more involved and getting them into a space to where they can see the reality of how this can actually be implemented.
Digital in emerging markets, is that a no-brainer? I know there's been instances where, like the drone story in Rwanda, where they're prepared to experiment with digital technologies. Talk a little about that, because I think that's what makes this almost exciting, is the fact that they have so far to go. If they have the courage to leap, the technology is there to help them.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of points around that. So one, I think when you look at developing countries, they've made one of the biggest leapfrogs in terms of telecommunications. And they've just totally bypassed landlines and they've gone straight to mobile. And the mobile, the adoption of mobile has been significant. And that is actually driving a lot of different development of apps. It's driving a lot of virtual communications, and that I think one great example is mobile money. So M-Pesa has been around I think for about 10 years now, and yet in the US and Europe we're still slowly catching on with some of that payments. You mentioned the drones, so there's many governments, not just in Rwanda, but also Tanzania, Ghana, Vanuatu, even Papua New Guinea as well, and they're looking at, they've done trials with using drones for medicine delivery, not just medicines, but also for blood as well too, and so they're developing regulation around that and policies around that, all of which again I think that the developed countries can leverage. So I think there's a big appetite. I think some of the challenges, though, are that the disadvantage of not having legacy systems is their approach to data and their approach to processes are not as mature as they need to be. And I think, we all agree that there's no point in implementing solutions, any kind of technical solution, unless you have the appropriate processes and the appropriate skills in place. But I do think as well there are opportunities to accelerate through. Like, I feel very fortunate working in supply chain and having come from the high-tech industry. I think it is the one discipline to where we have this advantage of hindsight.
Right.
Because different industries have performed and have matured their supply chains at different paces. And so we have the advantage of looking at the challenges that P&G had. We have the advantages of looking at the challenges that the high-tech industry have. And in the developing countries, we have the opportunity to look at the challenges that life sciences and everybody else have, and we can actually apply lessons learned to that, so we can actually accelerate much quicker. You know, you talked about the challenges for TraceLink moving from this regulatory serialization focus to supply chain visibility. And I think what's really interesting in these developing markets is that the regulatory challenges are there. But there's a learning that's needed, or there's kind of an awareness that's needed around the value of serialization and how to get there in a more informed way, right? Because I think what we see, the optics that we're seeing is that, like, Europe has struggled with it, US has struggled with it, so I think a lot of the regulatory agencies are kind of a little bit gun shy of it. And so I think that there's a very, very unique opportunity to use the supply chain visibility as the entry points and building that foundation for the serialization. So you almost flip it. So TraceLink have this opportunity to go supply chain visibility into invisibility first and do the serialization after that.
Right.
And because they're so good at the serialization, they can actually build that supply chain visibility on the back of that.
I think we're in a fascinating times because technology is just as available to emerging markets as what it is to established markets. And so there's no constraint to deploying this, buying and deploying it. It's really exciting.
It is, and I think also there's a couple of drivers as well that are worth looking at. You know, when we look at the amount of money that's being spent on medicine procurement in a lot of low middle income countries, there is significant, like there's billions every year from UNICEF, from USAID, from the Global Fund, from Gavi that's being spent. And in addition to that, there's also millions, hundreds of millions that's been spent on improving the supply chain. And the reason that we're seeing this supplemental money going into strengthening the supply chains is because the focus has always been on let's buy medicines, let's get them into the country, but not necessarily focusing on getting them to the patient. And so now there's this realization that they need to build out these systems to ensure that the medicines are getting to where they need to get to, but they don't have the visibility. So they get reports, it's very much paper-based systems, but they get reports that are 2 or 3 months behind, and they're realizing that that's not helping in terms of the planning. So they're addressing some stockouts and some wastage, but not the way that they need to be doing it. So now there's a big focus on how do we take the inefficiencies out of the systems that are there and ensure that the products are getting to the patients.
So, and to do that, you have to look at the process, and I think that's what the exciting part is.
And I think there's a lot of value in that can be brought back into some of the developed countries as well too, in actually deploying the solutions, getting that visibility, and then looking at how that data can actually be used. And I think that given the trajectory for some of the companies, I think there's possibilities that can actually be achieved quicker in some of these developing countries.